Hi friends, so I wanted to give you a little rundown, my own personal thoughts about the Australian federal election that took place last night and where the Scott Morrison government, who was already in, was returned, unfortunately. The Scott Morrison government is a conservative, racist, xenophobic, Islamophobic, minority group crushing, corporate serving party, and now we'll see this as a mandate to go ahead and continue on serving corporations and crushing the rest of us and throwing us crumbs. And this seems to be happening all around the world, where there's two parties usually in various countries, like this happens in the United States, where there's two parties, and one is what the juice media here calls, the juice media is a satirical group, which is probably the only independent news left is a satire group, but the juice media calls the two parties here the shit party and the shit light party. I would have to agree with that. Anyway, I want to actually quickly run down a very brief history of the Labor Party and why it actually has turned out to be a party that can't seem to challenge this party. You know, this is almost like it's unbelievable they couldn't win this election against this party. And of course, we have a preferential system here in Australia, preferential voting, or what some people in America would call ranked choice voting. So we actually have more than two parties to choose from, and that's a healthy democracy. But I don't know if actually a lot of Australians actually utilize this preferential voting. And of course, you don't really hear any of these parties, the major parties, ever mentioning preferential voting because they don't want people to do that. The CIA helped overthrow Gough Whitlam in 1975. They even admitted it. And so Gough Whitlam's government was dismissed, and Gough Whitlam was for free healthcare, free public education. They were for Indigenous rights. They were, as far as I can tell, he was against war, and he didn't want to play ball. He didn't want to submit to the US empire, and that's why, as usual, the CIA, that democracy-loving country, the US, helped overthrow Gough Whitlam, because you can't have any sort of country that isn't submitting to US empire. And I call the US an empire because it has 800 bases worldwide, plus. So anyway, so Gough Whitlam was overthrown with the help of the CIA in 1975, and it's been a neoliberal mess ever since. Prime Minister Bob Hawke, who was elected in 1983, he wasn't really much better, and he actually helped he and Paul Keating, both Labor Prime Ministers, both helped deregulate various things. They helped, Paul Keating helped consolidate the Murdoch press, which is partly why we have this government today, in great part in many ways. That's Rupert Murdoch I'm talking about. Bob Hawke and Paul Keating also helped destroy the unions. These are Labor Prime Ministers. There's a list of things that they did that were very problematic. So they were neoliberal Prime Ministers. And as I said, it's been a neoliberal mess ever since. So that's sort of, and of course now the Labor Party that was led by Bill Shorten and the other Prime Ministers, Rudd and Gillard and those people like that, they have sort of been moved to the centre and have been sort of ignoring the criticisms about that party. They had a massive bunch of people that were supporters left the Labor Party for a while, and then they decided they better give some power to the various local groups so they have some say in things, but really that's not really working very well. And they're still ignoring the fact that they're not being what Labor should be, and that is pushing for social equality, strengthening unions so that workers have more rights. They're not addressing New Start, which is a unemployment benefit, which is absolutely ridiculously low, and so people who are on it can't survive, they can't pay their rents, and a lot of them end up homeless. And they refuse to even, before this election, even commit to a certain level of increase for New Start. That's the kind of party that the Labor Party has become. It's just basically been trying to become like a shit light, as the juice media calls them. They're not bold like the neoconservatives, who just basically are very obviously, well, they pretend they're going to do one thing and do something else, of course, but they have no policies, like the Scott Morrison government had no policies, but spent all their time attacking these Labor policies, which were better than they had been, meaning they were actually, there was, some talk of healthcare and there was different things like that, but they were all sort of, wishy-washy, and that's the problem, and they left it too late to actually really be talking about it. And it wasn't really. Also, they had as leader Bill Shorten, who nobody seemed to like, and they wouldn't let go of him. And so that sort of Scott Morrison was the preferred prime minister, even though he's awful. So that tells you something about how little people like Bill Shorten. This is the one that was running for the Labor Party in this election. So they had some sort of wishy-washy policies that were kind of Labor things, but they weren't really strong. And the Scott Morrison government, the coalition government, they actually just attacked those policies, and they had the full backing of the Murdoch press, which owns most of the press in Australia. So there was a big fear campaign against the Labor Party during this election. I'm not blaming the Murdoch press entirely for it, or the fact that the Scott Morrison, who had no policies but just spent his time attacking the Labor policies, I'm not saying they're all to blame. I think the Labor Party, the Australian Labor Party, has had a history of just moving to the centre, and I'm worried that because of this loss, that they're going to see that this is some sort of an excuse to move to the right, and not do anything that is supposed to be a Labor thing to do. I don't know, but that's what could happen. I really don't know if they're going to learn any lessons from this. Instead of just listening to the criticisms that they've got to stop being neoliberals and start being the Labor Party, they just seem to go on ignoring that. And the other thing that happened, of course, is in Queensland, which was the one that had the biggest swing towards the neoconservative Scott Morrison government. What happened there, it seems, is that the United Party sent a lot of preferences to them, and the United Party is a xenophobic corporate-serving party run by Clive Palmer, who's very, very wealthy, and who, basically he's a dodgy guy, and so and the One Nation, which is a racist party. So they sent their preferences, I think, to the coalition government, and but that's not really so much the problem as was the Adani coal mine, which is going to be one of the largest coal mines in the world, and that is sort of inland from Mackay in Queensland. And unfortunately, a lot of people in Queensland seem to think that they're going to benefit in some way from this coal mine, as if the trickle-down effect actually is real, which it isn't. It's been proven time and time again that the profits go up to the corporations, and very little goes down to people who are actually working for them or to the community. And what's worse is that it's actually a backward step as far as the climate crisis. So you've heard the saying, "No jobs on a dead planet." So all those people who voted for the coalition because of this Adani coal mine, I hope you enjoy it when we have no food, because the climate will be so unpredictable that food won't grow, and it's already happening. So when you're sitting there and you've got nothing to eat, you can say, well, we had our coal mining jobs, and our community was benefiting in some ways from the coal mine, but now we have nothing to eat. So no jobs on a dead planet, that's what I say to that. And I think that's very unfortunate that people were prepared to go with an outdated form of energy, coal, which is, it'll be producing dirty coal with a lot of ash, and they're going to pay for it greatly. We're all going to pay for it. The whole planet is going to pay for that. And in a country like Australia, which has abounds in solar and wind, we could have had, if we'd had any sort of forward-thinking governments, either Labor or coalition, we would have already had a booming industry of alternative energy. And China, this is one of the reasons, I'll just digress quickly, that China is actually pursuing very, very aggressively an alternative energy industry, because they see that oil is, they see that they're in a vulnerable position if they keep relying on oil, fossil fuels, because the US empire is pursuing any country that has oil pursuing them as in wanting to overthrow them, like Venezuela, that has the largest reserves of oil. They did that to Iraq. Look at what they did to Iraq. It's totally destroyed in many ways. They're looking at Iran because Iran has the fourth largest oil reserves on the planet, and they're going to want to overthrow Iran again and destroy that country and have a managed chaos situation in Iran. That's what these fossil fuels are bringing us: terrible pollution and war. And it also is making any country that is reliant on fossil fuels, it's making us all vulnerable. So that's why China is a big threat to the US, because the US recognizes China is actually is overtaking them as a great economic power, and also that they're pursuing alternative energy, which is threatening their oil. Is threatening the oil barons, the corporations that produce oil. There's a number of them, and that it's threatening that whole industry. And so that's one of the reasons they want to crush China and possibly even go to war with China. Anybody who's an economic threat to the US is basically somebody that they start to demonize and then want to invade and overthrow, etc., or destroy. So anyway, that's what China is doing, and that's what we could have been doing. We could have been pursuing these alternative energies and have actually been standing in a really great position at this point, but we've not had anybody with any vision as leaders in this country for a long, long time, since Gough Whitlam, really, in 75. And so that's sort of one of the reasons, and also one of the reasons that people are so desperate in this country, in Australia, is because there's a lot of personal debt, which is really, the personal debt is actually quite crushing for people. And so when people get desperate and, they're financially stressed like that, they start making really poor decisions. So that's another contributing factor to why probably some Queenslanders voted for the coalition government, thinking that this is going to help them financially in some way. But I blame Labor in great part for this situation of debt, because if they hadn't been continuing on these neoliberal policies, we might have a bit of social equality here and far less homelessness. And we would have still had free healthcare. I mean, I have to have private health insurance because in the 90s I was on a waiting list for something that I needed to have attended, and it went on and on and on. And eventually I realized that it's just not our public health system has been so debilitated by neoliberalism, and that's the intention, so that you can privatize things. It's been so debilitated, and the Labor Party has helped with that by not being strong about free healthcare, that I had to go and get private health insurance, and so I've had that for 20 years. Now I can still get free healthcare in some ways, but the waiting lists for different things are really scary, and I don't want to ever have to go through that sort of scare again, where I couldn't. That's Alia in the background there, who's jumping around. She loves playing in the dirt. And she has a little Bird Be Safe collar on, and no, we don't like to dress up our cats. I just think I just always say that just to let you know. Anyway, so that's sort of that's the situation of, the growing social inequality in this country, is because there has been no real alternative to the neoconservatives, because they're all trying to be popular. They think that they're doing the right thing by moving further to the centre, but what they're doing is they're a poor version of the neoconservatives. That's what they're being. And the Australian Green Party is not much better. They've been trying to move to the centre because there are people in there that want to get into power, and so they don't have any vision. They're always reacting to things. They don't show any vision. There is no vision for this country, really. And I have to say that this outcome, I felt like I was going to have a panic attack last night when I'm going to say some more about this, but I just want to share my personal feelings about what I feel about this. It's been hard enough having these two parties trotting along, and things have been getting worse and worse in Australia. And it's been particularly bad, this Scott Morrison government, because they're outwardly Islamophobic, homophobic, transphobic. I have friends who are Muslim, and I feel so awful for them that it just must be awful. It's bad enough when you're a white person. If you're an Indigenous person, it's awful. If you're a Muslim, it's awful. It's just dreadful. if you're unemployed, and there's institutionalized unemployment here, and so, you know, they've been given this sort of amount of money that's just disgusting and unlivable. So, you know, I've found, particularly in these last few years, Australia has become unrecognisable to me. I'm not saying that in the 80s or anything, the late 70s, it was fabulous, but I know that when I was in my 20s, it was sort of more doable. You know, there was less inequality. I'm not talking about Indigenous people. That's always been a big problem. The sort of lack of addressing issues in relation to Indigenous people and the mortality rates and all of that. But I'm saying, just in a general sense, it was less. There was less inequality, and there was free healthcare, and you could go to a university for free, and all that kind of thing. So, you know, it was better. I have to say it was better. And I'm not doing that, in the old days it was much better. No, it actually was. So anyway, but now it's just sort of like it's heading towards what it's like in the United States, and that's just a nightmare. I don't know how people survive, most people, how they survive in the United States. It's just crushing and just so unjust, and the poverty levels and the homelessness and the sacrifice zones and all of that, it's just dreadful. And that's where we're heading. And these silly people, those who voted for the coalition in Queensland, don't realise that they're actually inevitably voting against their interests, because neoconservatives and neoliberals, but neoconservatives like that, they do not care about the public. They do not care about you or me. What they care about is lining their pockets. What they care about is serving corporations, and eventually after they leave politics, they get some sort of job in relation to these corporations. They care about themselves, and they care about their business buddies. That's what they care about. And these people who have voted for this government thinking that they're somehow going to help them because they didn't even really express any policies that they were going to do. It seems like in Australia we've gone into this personality politics where, you know, if you like the look of that person, or you like the sound of them, or if you can have a beer with them, that kind of nonsense. If you think you can have a beer with them, that somehow makes them good. And Bill Shorten fell short of that particular personality politics thing. I'm not saying he was any good even in policies particularly, but, you know, when it came to, I think people are starting to, they're not looking at the behaviours of these governments while they're in office. And I don't think they truly scrutinise if they're any better off after these people have been in office for a while. I can see this happening again if the Labor Party doesn't pick somebody who is able to stand up to them, and if they don't change their policies and start being a real Labor, which addresses all those issues I just talked about. If they don't do that, then we're going to continue on getting awful governments like that, like the Scott Morrison government. They're just going to get worse and worse until we just have rulers and we are the plebs, the serfs, basically. That's what it's going to be, just like what is happening in the United States. And the Greens Party are just seem to be desperately trying to be popular, and that means sacrificing real things. I mean, some of the campaigns that they come up with are just so, I think, what on earth? You know, you're not addressing the real issues at all. Even the Labor Party, they were sort of talking about giving us money for roads down here and for boat ramps because we like fishing, apparently. I mean, I'm vegan. I have no interest in fishing, but even if I did, I mean, there is homelessness in Hobart and around the place. There are people that can't afford to actually live in a rented house anymore because rents are so ridiculous. And the list goes on with the sort of problems all over Australia that we're having. And these are the sort of ridiculous, patronising campaigns that people come up with. Boat ramps and money, millions and millions of dollars for roads when people are struggling to survive. So, I don't know, I felt like curling up into a fetal ball last night. I felt like I was going to have a panic attack. I was so shocked. And just to let you know how shocking this was, this outcome, all the polls, you know, all of them, no matter if they were skewed or what, all the polls showed that Labor was about, I think, 52 and the coalition was 49. All of them said something like that. And the exit polls, which are polls that are taken, and by the way, we have, you know, a paper ballot system, so it's pretty hard to mess with a paper ballot system, but I still want to know how the exit polls actually demonstrated that Labor was going to win. I don't understand how that could possibly be. So the fact that general polls had all said that Labor was probably going to win, and the exit polls were all suggesting Labor was going to win, and it was so the opposite to that. In fact, the Liberals actually sort of kind of swept in. It was a bit of a bloodbath, basically. It wasn't even close. I think Labor at this point is like 63. 63, and the coalition is 74. It wasn't even close. So I would like somebody, if you know of any information of why all these polls were wrong and the exit polls were wrong, please leave comments in the comment section, because I find that very strange. And if it wasn't for the fact that we have paper ballots and that our electoral system is quite good in that way, it's quite transparent, I would be calling electoral fraud at this point with how badly the polls were wrong and how badly the exit polls were wrong. So anyway, so that Adani mine, I think in Queensland, that really people making a stupid decision and thinking that that is going to somehow fix things for them, make their lives better, and just sacrificing the whole climate crisis, for these short-term possible benefits, which probably won't be that beneficial. And it'll certainly create heaps of pollution up in Queensland, and generally because of all the coal and the dirty coal or whatever, it's going to be a real problem. It's the largest coal mine, I think, in the world, so it's going to be a real problem for everybody in the world. So I'm really, really disappointed that people chose that sort of ridiculous selfishness. I mean, imminent extinction is coming. Imminent extinction is on the horizon, and this is what we're doing. This is how we're responding to it, by saying, oh, jobs, jobs, jobs. I mean, this is all you hear in this country. And you see, that's what I mean by, and this is the other problem. They also, the other problem is that a lot of us in Australia are economically illiterate. And you've heard me talk about modern monetary theory, and no, it's not a theory. It's not something that needs to be implemented. It's just something that is a sovereign economy. It's a description, simply a description of how the operational reality of a sovereign economy works. And I heard Scott Morrison, and none of these politicians use the sovereign economy as they should, but I heard Scott Morrison last night, just before they signed off, saying, and we'll bring the budget into a surplus. Well, you know what that means, if you know anything about a sovereign economy, what that means. And the government, by the way, a government budget is not the same as a household budget. And that's what they keep putting out there, that the government budget is the same as a household budget, which is just straight out lie. It's an economically illiterate lie, and we've been told that over and over and over again, that the government budget is like a household budget. And the problem with saying things like, we're going to bring it into a surplus, what that means is it's going to be cutting social programs for people. It's going to be causing greater social inequality and taking money away from the public. And that's what's going to end up. It's going to end up that we'll be worse off, and there's going to be more social inequality and more people homeless and so forth. That's what that means when a government says we're going to bring the budget into a surplus. So, that to me, when you understand this, when you have some sort of understanding of a sovereign economy, that just makes me feel very, very stressed. This is what this economically illiterate nonsense they keep putting out to the public. And also the other economically illiterate nonsense they keep putting out is that federal taxes fund spending, and that you have to tax the rich to be able to afford these different programs, or that you have to tax people to be able to afford these different programs. That's absolutely an economic lie that they keep putting out there, and that's why I invite you to learn MMT. Look it up. I'll leave some links. You can look at stephaniekelton.com and go to Real Progressives on Facebook, RealProgressive on Facebook, and they talk about that regularly. And people need to understand that, because we are being led into this lie. I mean, it's important, of course, to tax the rich for ethical reasons, but taxes do not do what people think they do. Of course, we need to have taxes for reasons other than what we usually think they are, and federal taxes have nothing to do with funding anything. So that's why we need to understand that, so we can say to politicians that say that, you're lying. We don't need to tax anybody federally to be able to afford free healthcare, free public education, and so forth. And the same goes with any sovereign economy. So that's why we need to understand that, so we can say, you are lying, and then tell them why they're lying, and say, now go ahead and do what you can do, because we have a currency issuing economy, and the only constraints are resources. And if you're worried about inflation, you can find that out if you look into this further. But that's the other thing that's really problematic, and that the Australian Labor Party also feed into that nonsense, and so do the Greens. And I invite you to follow Bill Mitchell, Professor Bill Mitchell from the Centre for, Unemployment and Equity, I think it is, the Centre for Equity and Unemployment, COFFEE, COFFEE. I think I've got that title wrong, but Professor Bill Mitchell has been talking about modern monetary theory for a long time, and we need to understand that here in Australia. Okay, so anyway, so that's the sort of things that I feel like the Labor Party has contributed to the arrival of this second time. Well, we've had the coalition now this will be the third, I think, the third term for the coalition, these neoconservatives. And it just gets worse and worse. And I feel like because the Australian Labor Party just won't, they won't look at and criticise their own direction. They don't seem to be able to internally sort of look for real reasons. They want to blame the Murdoch press, and of course they are to blame, of course, greatly in some ways, but their own policies in the Australian Labor Party are neoliberal policies, and they're not really for the people. They're trying to do this ridiculous tightrope, or having one foot in both camps, and the other camp, the corporations, win. You have to sort of you have to be able to serve the people, and that's not what they're doing. They're not doing that. Paul Keating helped the Murdoch press consolidate their stranglehold on the information that we get. Now it's just propaganda. You should read the papers. Of course, they're like this every day, but you should read the papers today. Read online news sources today. It's just dreadful propaganda. And they make out as if if Labor ever talks about something that is for the people, like improving healthcare, they make out like it's some foreign sort of weird thing that is really something to be frightened of. I mean, this is how insane it is. Anything that is actually for the public, the Murdoch press vilify and try and distort and frighten people. I mean, it's insane that anybody would buy this sort of nonsense. People have, in Australia, a lot of people, the ones that voted for this coalition government, have voted ultimately against their own interests, except for the ones who benefit from corporations, benefit from businesses, or they benefit in some ways from those neoconservative policies. And there are a number of people, there are rich people in Australia, and they do benefit. But there are a lot of people there's also racists and Islamophobes, and they've also voted just because they love it when governments are, crushing minority groups and vilifying Muslims and so forth. There's a certain amount of racism in Australia, there really is, and in Queensland there certainly is. If you're voting for the coalition or the One Nation or whatever, then you obviously don't give a toss about these minority groups. But then Labor isn't winning any awards for that either. They say all the right things, but they're sort of, I don't know. I mean, they're better in some ways at that than the Liberal government, but they're not better. Their asylum seeker policies are racist. They're awful. These detention centres on Nauru and Manus that have killed people because they're so abusive. They're psychological and physical torture, and this is how we treat people who are fleeing the Western imperialist wars that we are causing in their countries. We leave them to rot indefinitely in these awful detention centres, and people harm themselves, and the children are like zombies, because they're so traumatized, and there's abuse and all sorts of things there of children. And this is the Labor Party endorsing those racist asylum seeker policies because they can't stand up for them. They're trying to appease right-wingers so that they can bring in more votes. I mean, see, this is the problem. When you try and you go to the centre, when you move to the centre, you end up sort of basically making yourself just a wishy-washy version of the right-wingers. Anyhow, I think that's all I was going to say about that. Oh, and one more thing. This is the other problem with the Australian Labor Party, is that they endorse Juan Guaido, who is a self-appointed military coup person, who the United States, he is a U.S. puppet, and he tried to do a military coup in Venezuela. He's part of the opposition there, who wants the U.S. to come in, has actually invited them in to do a military invasion of Venezuela, but has actually been, sort of set up there and funded by the U.S. to do a military coup. So they've tried to crush Venezuela with crippling U.S. economic sanctions. And 40,000 Venezuelans are now dead due to crippling U.S. sanctions from 2017. And Juan Guaido has actually been inviting the UK to impose more economic sanctions on Venezuela. So that's how much he cares about Venezuelans in his own country. There's a class struggle going on there, the Bolivarian Revolution, and the lighter-skinned Venezuelans who are business owners and whatever. They're sort of wealthy, and they want the US to come in so that everything can be privatized and they can profit. They don't want the darker skinned people in Venezuela to get anything. They want another sort of a feudal system within Venezuela. So that's why they've been constantly trying to destabilize the government. They didn't participate in the last election, and yet then had the nerve to call it corrupt elections, even though 6 million plus Venezuelans voted for President Maduro, and it was overseen by the Carter group, who said they were the most transparent elections, the best in the world. They've been backpedaling, the Carter group. That's because pressure has been put on them by the U.S. government, but that's what they said at the time of these elections. And the opposition, the Juan Guaido, who hardly anybody knows, wasn't participating in that. The opposition refused to participate in that, and that's what happened. So that's their own fault. And they dared to say then that it's not a fair election. Please. Anyway, so Juan Guaido is basically fine with 40,000 Venezuelans that have died now since 2017 from the U.S. economic sanctions, and the U.S. keeps applying more and more sanctions. So the Australian Labor Party is essentially endorsing a genocide of Venezuelans. And the other thing that there is another disgusting aspect of the Australian Labor Party, apart from the fact that they seem to support everything that the US empire asks them to do. It's like, they ask, how high do you want us to jump? So that's how they are. And on top of that, Julian Assange has been abandoned by both the coalition and the Labor Party. And he's likely to end up in the US with 45 years of solitary confinement and torture, and possibly even be executed. And the Australian Labor Party has done nothing. In fact, I've done a video just recently of what Tanya Plibersek retweeted by Neera Tanden, who is a neoconservative, really. She's not really a liberal, but she pretends she is. She's Center of American Progress. Oh no, here's Rooney's trying to jump up my back. She endorsed something that was really awful, basically calling everybody who supported Julian Assange a cultist. Now, the thing about Julian Assange is his only crime, in quotes, is that he was doing journalism, and the Australian Labor Party can't seem to understand that this is a press freedom issue, and that if he gets extradited to the United States, that sets an awful precedent for the rest of the world. They can't seem to recognize that, or are willfully ignorant of that. So that's another strike against them, as far as I'm concerned, just abandoning that man to this cruel empire. And the UK Belmarsh prison is a dreadful prison. And Pamela Anderson, the actor, said, he needs to be gotten out of there, or he's going to basically die in there. I could go on about that, but I've done a few videos on that, so please check them out. Those sort of things, just groveling along and submitting to US empire over and over again, and all the awful things that the US empire is doing, and also just abandoning Julian Assange and supporting a genocide in Venezuela, all these things. And also, I'm sure they'll probably be participating in selling arms to Saudi Arabia, who is conducting a genocide in Yemen. That's also going on. And Christopher Pyne from the coalition was selling arms to Saudi Arabia, knowing probably full well what they're doing in Yemen. Now, one child has been dying every 10 minutes of disease and famine for the last 3 years in Yemen. There's been about, I think, 68,000 or something children have died of disease and famine since this Saudi genocide that's been happening in Yemen, which you barely hear about in the mainstream media. This is the problem with having a mainstream media that is owned by Murdoch or owned by 6 corporations in the world, you don't hear about this sort of thing. They don't tell you about this intentionally. Anyway, for anybody who's an Australian citizen and wants to find some independent journalism, please check out the Empire Files or the Grey Zone Project or the Real News Network. What else is there? Moderate Rebels. I'll leave some links that you can check out, because we need to be educated about this so that we can actually act on it. Anyway, that's my take on this whole election, and I feel like the Labor Party is probably going to pick another person who is just a neoliberal as their leader, and they probably will still be wishy-washy, and I can see that the coalition is going to win again. You know, if they don't become a real alternative and actually have some brave positions that they used to have when Gough Whitlam was in office, then we're just going to keep on getting more of the same. This awful, awful Islamophobic, racist, minority-crushing, gutless, US empire-serving, corporation-serving government that we have right now. And I really fear for the country in the direction it's going. And Australia is unrecognisable to me at this point. It's absolutely unrecognisable. Anyway, and there are no jobs on a dead planet. So all those people who voted because they wanted a Adani coal mine, you're going to get a rude shock in the not-too-distant future. Within probably 2050, it's going to be a disaster for us all, possibly even actual extinction in the next 30 or 40 years. So anyway, thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button if you like the content, and please click the notifications bell, otherwise you don't receive updates. Please click the like button if you like the content, and do check out some of my playlists. I have a vegan playlist. It gets longer and longer, and it's got lots of information on it. And if you're not vegan, please consider going vegan and check out howtogovegan.org. That's my comprehensive vegan podcast. If you're watching Faint Signals from Vega, my name's Trish Roberts. Till next time, bye for now.